Well, the ocean is deep and it is wide. The ocean is deep and it is wide. Well, the ocean's deep and it is wide. It ain't got no bottom, got no side. There's no hiding place down there. There's no hiding place down there. There's no hiding place down there. I went to the rock to hide my face. That rock cried out, no hiding place. There's no hiding place down there. Oh, my soul is hidden in God's love. My soul is hidden in God's love. Oh, my soul is hidden in God's love. It's never safe in heaven above. There's no hiding place down there. There's no hiding place down there. There's no hiding place down there. Well, I went to the rock to hide my face. The rock cried out, no hiding place. There's no hiding place down there. Well, there's no hiding place down there. There's no hiding place down there. Well, I went to the rock to hide my face. That rock cried out, no hiding place. There's no hiding place down there. Is no hiding place down there. Is no hiding place down there. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Well, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine. Oh, don't you try to blow it out. Well, I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, don't you try to blow it out. Yeah, I'm gonna let it shine. Don't you try to blow it out. I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Well, hiding under a bushel, no, I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, hiding under a bushel, no, I'm gonna let it shine. Bushel, no, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. shine, let it shine. Well, hold it high so all can see. Yeah, I'm gonna let it shine. Yeah, hold it high so all can see. Yeah, I'm gonna let it shine. Hold it high so all can see. Yeah, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. This light of mine, yeah, I'm gonna let it shine, yeah, this little light of mine, yeah, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, yeah, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Oh, let it shine. When Jesus was 12, the family went up for Passover, as was his parents' custom to do every year. And as they were returning after spending the full number of days, Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. And his parents didn't even know it. They thought that he was somewhere in the caravan. And after a day's journey, they began looking for him among their relatives and acquaintances, but they couldn't find him. So then they went back to Jerusalem and started looking around the city. And finally, after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting there in the midst of the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. Now, when his parents saw him, they were dumbfounded, overjoyed, really angry. And his mother said, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I were worried sick looking for you." And Jesus said to them, "Why were you searching? Did you not know that I had to be in my Father's house?" They had no idea what he was trying to tell them. And so Jesus went with them back to Nazareth and continued to be in submission to them. And his mother, well, she just treasured all these things in her heart. This is not the origin of Home Alone 2: Lost in the City. Just wanted to be clear about that. In fairness to Jesus' mom and dad, to Mary and Joseph, this is not like they were being careless. What almost certainly happened was, okay, backstory. I served at church from 1987 through 1996 that had in their memory a time when the men sat on one side and the women sat on the other. And when I was there, that custom was long gone, except at the potlucks. And then all the guys were on one side and all the women were on the other, and I would like mess things up by sitting down with the women sometimes. It would just throw everything off. So that is an old practice to divide men and women in religious settings. It's been going on for a very long time. It still continues today in more conservative synagogues. Women are actually behind a screen.
separated from the men. In the temple, there was an area that the women went to and the men went differently. And so in a lot of these kinds of instances, coming into the holy city, the custom would be to divide up into two camps as the caravan. It's a lot of people going into Jerusalem. And they would kind of separate into a men's line and a women's line. And the children would be with the women. But the thing is, because Jesus is 12, he's in that kind of in-between place. He's actually preparing for he's in confirmation class. He's preparing for a bar mitzvah, basically. Okay, we don't know for sure if in the first century they did bar mitzvah the way we think of it today, but there was something that would happen when you're 13, an acknowledgement that you've now moved into a responsible adulthood, at least from a religious point of view. So that's where he was. And so it's not... It's the kind of time when maybe a 12-year-old might be with dad instead of with mom. So it's a natural assumption that they made. And as they leave, they're also separated until they get to a certain point. It's a day's journey. That's about 5 to 8 miles. Then they can join together again. And that's when they discover Jesus is gone. So, of course, they have to go back to the city and start looking for him. And there he is in the temple. Now, who knows how long he's been in the temple. It's really hard to say how long they lost track of this kid, right? I mean, they may not have known where he was for a really long time before that. But, they searched 3 days, and then it was a day. So it was at least 4 days, and probably longer, that they've lost track of him. And he's in the temple, and he's with the teachers and with the rabbis and the scholars, and he's engaged in this interesting conversation. I should tell you something about the conversation. There's two different styles of teaching. So there's a style of teaching called the Socratic method, named after Socrates, Socrates, the Greek philosopher. And the way this, we should call it, never mind, ADD is kicking in. I was going to tell you we should call it the Platonic method, but that would involve me having to explain why, so I won't tell you that. The Socratic method goes like this. The teacher asks questions and the students answer them. Now, in the typical way that manifests itself in schools today, the teacher will ask a question for which there's a simple right answer, like, what year did that happen? And then somebody blurts out the correct answer. So it's seeking a correct answer. The true Socratic method is to go through a series of questions to guide the student to an understanding. So the teacher has to ask questions like, oh, well, what about this? Oh, yeah? And now if that's true, then this, and sort of guide the student through the series of questions and answers to a particular wise outcome. But that's technically Socratic method. The rabbinic method is exactly the opposite. The way the rabbis would do it is that they would say something, a provocative statement or sometimes story, to which people would begin to ask questions. The students would ask the questions in response to what the rabbis did. And we actually have examples of this in the teaching of Jesus. So he tells a parable, and then it says, and later when they were alone, the disciples said, okay, what does that mean? Right? They start asking questions about the parable. There's a story where Jesus is met by a guy. Guy comes to see him at night, and this guy who comes to see him calls him rabbi. And so Jesus responds with a provocative sense. He says, you got to be born again. And so this man who's come to him, recognizing what's going on here, Jesus is acting like a rabbi, he responds with a question, how can a man be born when he is old? He cannot enter again into his mother's womb, can he? And so that's the rabbinic method. What's interesting about this story is that Jesus is described first as following the true rabbinic method. It says, and they were astonished by his understanding and his questions, right? It says first that it's his questions that impressed them, which means he's a good student. And then it says everybody was amazed at his answers. Right? So first he was listening to them and answering and asking questions. And then they were astonished by his understanding and his answers, which means that we see here that Jesus is both the good student, but also you start to see a little bit of the rabbi, the coming rabbi. Now, here's why this is kind of interesting to me. Because when we talk about Jesus, we are talking about, right, Christian theology is that God becomes a human being, which I know is tough to work on and sometimes requires Tylenol or aspirin or Advil or something, if you think about it too hard. But that's the essence of Christian theology. So there Jesus is. Who knows what kind of capacity he has at 12? I mean, we know as an adult he walks on water. Could he walk on water when he was 12? I mean, and was he just kind of holding back? Because if I could have walked on water when I was 12, heck, if I could walk on water now, I'd be finding every puddle I could. Like I'd pour water on the floor and go, "Hey, watch me, folks." I mean, it would be embarrassing how often I'd be walking on water. I'd fill the sink up and say, "Let's all go in the kitchen and watch me walk on water." It'd be that bad. So for some reason, what we see is Jesus's actions all seem to have a it's like he's holding back, right? And it's not until he's an adult, until this sort of moment comes, we like to say, in the fullness of time, that things change and he starts to do miracles and he starts to speak openly. Before that, he seems to be sort of like biding his time. And it's really interesting. And so we have this story where Jesus, that you see the hints of the coming Messiah, the rabbi coming out, just hints of them, and then mom and dad show up. Now, you can imagine how that could be potentially very embarrassing, right? All the adults around are really impressed by this kid, and mom and dad come in going, "Where have you been? You made us crazy!" And you go from being respected by adults, which feels really good, to being scolded by your parents, which feels really bad. And they don't get it when he responds, "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house? I don't, what?" They have no clue what he's talking about. So what does it say? It says what he did was he went with them and he lived in submission to them. Natalie, do you hate being told what to do? Yeah. Do you ever say this? "You're not the boss of me." Yeah. I knew she would admit it freely, but you all do that, right? Even if you don't say it out loud, in your heart, you're thinking to yourself, "You're not the boss of me," even when they are your boss, right? "You're not really the boss of me. I'm only doing this because I want to get paid," right? We don't like this. The idea, when we hear the word submit, we do not like that word because first it sounds like obey. Nobody likes to obey. That just feels really bad. And it's true that to submit sometimes means to obey, but it doesn't always mean to obey. Sometimes to submit means to yield. Someone else is, there's like two things that, well, you may have done this if you've been in a relationship for a while. You're like, what movie do you want to go see? And one of you wants to go see, Star Wars. And the other one wants to go see Little Women. How do you solve that problem? Somebody's going to have to yield. By the way, for the record, have seen both. Like Star Wars, because, it's Star Wars. Little Women is really good. Really enjoyed seeing that. Though, at the time, I said, my wife says, "We should go see a movie. What do you want to go see?" I said, "Well, I figured you would want to see Little Women, right? So I thought we would go see that," right? You hear that? Submission. That's what submission looks like. And she said, "Well, I didn't think you'd want to see it." And I said, "Oh, no, it's because I'm thinking to myself, I think I've seen every other version of Little Women ever made. I think this one was the best. I really liked this one. It was so well acted and story. And now I'm doing movie reviews. Oh, okay." But you understand, sometimes that's what we do in relationships. We yield. Sometimes we compromise. Sometimes we make concessions. But the problem is, a lot of times to do those things feels like we're demeaning ourselves or that we're diminishing ourselves, like we're made smaller by doing it. And so there's a part of us that resists, that I want my way. So it's helpful to have a really good definition of what the word submit actually means. And there's a perfect definition in the Bible. What's really interesting about this perfect definition is that nowhere in the definition do you find the word submit, but it's actually the perfect definition of submission. It's found in Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. The Apostle Paul writes this. He says, "Do not do anything out of pure self-interest, but rather consider the interests of others. Consider others as more important than yourselves." In other words, to submit is to take an action which is designed to benefit others, to produce a blessing in the lives of others. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't also receive blessings. And if you submit all the time, then you'll go hungry. But the idea here is that by submitting, we are blessing someone else. There's a benefit to someone else that redounds to them. That's what submission is about. And if we think of it not as I'm having to do something I don't want to do, and think of it as instead I get to do something that benefits or blesses someone else, we might not feel so put off by it, like it's being done to us. Like maybe it's okay. Now, like you, you're not the boss of me. Submission is difficult in my world, so I find it very helpful, the fact that I am particularly at United Methodist pastor, because like people always say to me, well, how did you end up at that church? Did they hire you, or how does that work? And I say, oh, well, I have a bishop who tells me where to go. But I do. I have a bishop who tells me where to go, and I go where my bishop tells me, and this is how it's an act of submission. I put myself under the authority of my bishop. I submit to the authority of my bishop, and my bishop says, go here, go there, I go there. That's how that works. Yeah. Okay, so it's good practice for me because I don't really like doing it. But now think about Jesus, right? So Jesus is God who becomes a human being and yet submits. Now, can you imagine this? I mean, at what point, you know this had to happen at least once. Mary had to look at him once and go, you may be the Son of God, but you still have to take out the garbage, right? You know that happened, don't you? And what does that mean? Why in the world would God submit to that? I mean, it's mind-boggling when you think about it. But again, I think the scriptures give us an insight into how Jesus is thinking about all of this. It's found in Hebrews, actually, the book of Hebrews, the 12th chapter. And the Bible says this, it says, keep your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. And then it says, who for the joy set before him endured the cross for our sakes. Who for the joy set before him. For Jesus looks at everything and sees that in submission there's an opportunity to bless us. And that joy outweighs whatever the negative might be about submitting, and so he submits with joy. Now, I want to suggest to you that being in submission doesn't mean being a doormat, because when we're a doormat, we do not benefit other people, right? So, for example, when Jesus submits himself to the authority of the Romans, he still makes the point that he goes willingly. When he submits himself to the authority of the high priest during his trial, he makes it clear that he does it because he submits himself to the will of the Father. Not because he's submitting to the will of the high priest, but because he's submitting to the will of the Father. He's not a doormat. Jesus is never a doormat. But his actions are actions which serve and bless others, and that's the joy that motivates what he's doing. Motivates him through the pain and the hurt and the struggle and all that goes along with that. And so as I think about this, and I think about the fact that, we just had New Year's, so I guess am I required to say this? I'm Diane Sawyer, and this is 2020. Right? So, but, as we come into 2020, here's the thing to think about. Because, I know that you're probably making New Year's resolutions. Here's one. In 2020, let's become more like Jesus. And maybe in this specific way, that we understand that for the joy set before us, we can submit to one another. Can you find the prayer response? It's printed right in the bulletin. Let's pray that together. It grates at me to submit. I feel diminished by obedience when submission requires obedience. I feel demeaned by yielding when submission requires yielding. Undermined by concessions when submission requires concessions. Cheapened by serving when submission requires serving. So I stubbornly resist, pushing back, seeking to assert my threatened dignity and endangered ego, How differently do you, O Jesus, you who are the great I am, set aside all in submission. You submit to human parents, human teachers, human expectations, and ultimately your submission to the Father entails death on the cross. Change my perceptions. Help me to see that same joy that was set before you. In your name I pray. Amen.
To follow Jesus, I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. No turning back. The world one joins me, still I will follow. Though no one joins me, still I will follow. Though no one joins me, still I will follow. No turning back. No turning back. World behind me, the cross before me, the world behind me, the cross before me, the world behind me, the cross before me, no turning back, no turning back. To follow Jesus, I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. No turning back.